Samuel Zwemer was nicknamed the Apostle to Islam. He was a late 19th century and early 20th century missionary to Muslims. His work really transformed the whole Western church viewpoint of Muslims because for so many centuries, Muslims appeared to the Western church as to people to battle against. But he changed that perspective to people who need Christ. And he tells some stories of things that happened in his ministry. He ministered in the Arab world for 40 years and didn't have a lot of converts. But he tells the story of one. He had been distributing tracts, gospel tracts, to university students in Cairo. And one professor in that university was so upset when he saw the tract, he tore it into a bunch of tiny pieces in a fit in front of his class and threw it on the floor. One particular student was curious as to what could possibly make a professor so upset, especially somebody who claimed to be looking for truth, and he gathered up all the pieces and taped them together and came to Christ through doing that. Pretty amazing story. And to me, it's amazing how God can use things like outbursts of anger to accomplish his work, even demonic type outbursts of anger to accomplish his work. But that's the sovereign God that we serve. Whatever happens in this life, he can use to accomplish his purpose. And that's just God. He is awesome. He is sovereign. Even the powers of evil, he puts to work to accomplish his purpose. And that's pretty amazing to us. Sometimes we think of the universe as this battle between good and evil, and there's these equal powers working it out, but that's not how it is. God is sovereign over it all. He rules over everything, even evil, and he uses evil to bring about his good purpose. There's one story I want to show you today that helps us see that, illustrates that point for us. And it's in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16. If you've been with us, you know we've been going through this book really since the beginning of the year. And we saw in the first section of this book the life of Samuel, and the book focused on him for about 8 chapters. In the next 7 or 8 chapters, it focused on Saul being the first king of Israel. And beginning in chapter 16, we saw last week, it begins to focus on the life of David, who becomes the next king in Israel. Saul, as a king, started out so well, but he didn't finish well. And we learned a couple weeks ago that when he had disobeyed God, God said, "You've rejected my word, so I've rejected you as being king. And I will put another one on your throne." And then last week we saw Samuel sent to David to anoint him as king, and looked at that story. And today we're going to pick that up at that point in the story. As Samuel anointed David, it says the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. And then the very next words are, the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and another spirit tormented him. And that's where the story picks up today. Saul was tormented by an evil spirit. He'd been disobedient to God. God had rejected him. God's spirit had left him. And now this evil spirit was tormenting him. Some people read this, and the language is a little unusual for spirits, but some people read this and they say it was possibly just a mental illness, just depression. But it's pretty clear that it's something way more powerful than that that's going on here. And it number of times calls it either in this translation a harmful spirit, in a lot of the translations an evil spirit that was tormenting him. It's something a whole lot more than mental problems. The depression that Saul had and was evident the rest of his life was a symptom of this. It's not the other way around. And so Saul's servants gave him an idea. They said, "Why don't you go find a musician? And he can play for you." It's interesting how they knew in the ancient world how powerful music can be. It's not unusual to find in the courts of ancient kings musicians or evidence of musicians, because they knew that it was such a powerful tool. Even way back in Plato's time, this is what he said. He said, "Musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul on which they might fasten." You see, the ancient world knew the power of music. And so Saul's servant says, why don't you find a musician to come and play for you? And so one of his servants spoke up. He said, I've seen this son of Jesse of Bethlehem, and he plays the lyre. And so he was reminded of that. It brings a couple interesting things to light. First of all, I want to talk about, just for history and curiosity, what David played. He played a lyre. And there's a picture up there. I'm going to pop another one up. There it is. The reason I put that picture up there, it looks a lot like the one in the other picture, but I put that one up there because that is a model that's built exactly after a lyre that was found in Israel that dates to about this time period. And so it's a rebuilt one. It's new, but it's modeled after one that we know, we know is from that era. And so that's the kind of instrument that David played. We don't know what kind of music or what it sounded like other than the sound of the lyre. There are some people out there that claim they can recreate the tunes from the Hebrew poetry, and they claim that by some various points underneath the Hebrew letters that we really don't know what they're for. These people claim that those are the music notes, and they've claimed to know how to recreate them. A lot of scholars dispute that idea, that they've really created it. The scholars that dispute it say, well, that's all based on a Western idea of music and not on an Israelite idea of music. It's based on our 8-point scale. Some people think that Hebrew music was a pentatonic scale, 5 notes in the scale. And if you don't know what that is, it's just like playing the black notes on a piano and nothing else. That's kind of what it's like. And some people think the music from that era was a pentatonic music. Well, we don't really know. They do talk about a 10-string lyre. I think the one that was up there has actually 10 strings on it, which would be 2 octaves if that's the case. But anyway, it's just some interesting things. What we do know is that David was a good musician. He was a good musician. He is called in one place the sweet singer of Israel. Kind of an interesting description, isn't it? But that's not the description of David that's given here. When the servant describes David, he describes him as a man of valor, a man of war. Now, I find that interesting, particularly in light of what we read last week, that he was the youngest of Jesse's sons. He wasn't the one that was expected in Samuel's mind to be king, and yet this describes him as a man of valor, a man of war. It seems inconsistent, doesn't it? Now, there's a couple possible explanations for that. Youngest doesn't necessarily mean he was the smallest. It doesn't mean he was not built like a warrior. In fact, it does say he was a good-looking young man. Possibly some time has passed. We don't know how long went between the time that David was anointed as king and the time that Saul invited him to play in his court. We don't know how long that was. It seems as you read it to be fairly quick, but we really don't know. And it's possible that this acquaintance of David knew some of the conflicts he had in the sheep fields, because we know David killed a lion and a bear in the sheep fields. And maybe this guy knew that and said, he's young, but he really is a warrior, and he's proved it. We don't know what he's getting at, but all 3 of those things, combination of all 3 of those at least explains the inconsistency that's there. But the most important thing he said wasn't that. It wasn't that he did music. It wasn't that he was a man of valor. The most important thing he said is, and the Lord is with him. The Lord had departed from Saul, but the Lord was with this David. And we pointed out last week that phrase is used often of various leaders in the Old Testament. In fact, the only commonality we see of all the leaders of the Bible are the Lord was with him. We don't see any other characteristics consistent except that one. And that was the case with David, and this servant recognized it. And so David was sent for. He was brought to Saul's court, and he was sent by his father along with some gifts for the king. And the music had its intended impact. It helped Saul. Saul really liked David. And it says that David became Saul's armor bearer. Now, it's possible, in fact, it's likely that a lot of young men served the king as attendants, and any one of them could have been called an armor bearer. So it may not be he was the one, he may be one of a number, which helps answer some questions that come up in the next story, which is the most famous story in the whole book, which we'll get to next week. Well, that's a quick summary of the story. And I went through that quickly because what I want to do today is read it to you. As we've been going through 2 Samuel, we've been covering big chunks of Scripture, and I haven't been reading them because we've just been looking at bits and pieces in order to get through it. But this is one of the shorter ones that we're going to look at, so I just want to read it to you. You can follow along on the screen or in your Bibles or in your devices, but I'll be reading beginning in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14, and all the way to the end of the chapter. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, Behold, now a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre. And the harmful spirit of God is when the harmful spirit of God is upon you, he will play it and you will be well. So Saul said to his servants, Provide a man for me who can play well and bring him to me. And one of the young men answered, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me David, your son, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat and sent them by David, his son, to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. And so Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So there's the story that we're looking at. It has some lessons for us today. And what I want to do is consider those lessons. I wrote 3 of them down, but some of them are lengthy, so we'll just begin plowing through them. The first one is this: music is powerful. Music is powerful. They knew that in the ancient world. We still know that today. We know that music is recognized as a form of both physical and mental therapy. You know, I never knew there was such a thing as music therapy until, about 8 or 9 years ago, my daughter said, I think I want to go to college and study music, to go into music therapy. And I had to look up what that was. And at that time, I had seen, I had seen during hospital visits people going through the hospitals. I know a couple of the hospitals in the area hired people just to go through with a guitar or a keyboard and play or sing for the patients. And I think that kind of ended at the pandemic, and I haven't seen that restarted. Maybe some have, but I haven't seen that. But they've learned that music can have a huge positive impact on the patients. I have numerous articles. I dug a bunch of them out and looked at them, but I didn't want to dwell on this point as long as the others, so I didn't refer to any of them. But one of them said an interesting thing. It said, in our studies, we recognize that a half hour of pleasurable music has the same calming effect as 10 milligrams of Valium. Isn't that fascinating? And so music is a powerful thing. Music has a way of drawing us in that nothing else can. It has a power to draw us in that way. I can still sing almost all the verses of the hymns I grew up with. Okay? They are stuck in my head. At the same time, I can sing most of the jingles of 1960s sitcoms because I know them all as well. And the music has that way of grabbing you. Parents, be careful about what your children listen to. It will impact their entire lives because music has that kind of power. And it's not just physical and mental, but it's also spiritual as well. It's why music is such a huge part of the Bible, and particularly the praise passages in the Bible. It's the perfect medium for praise because of its power. The New Testament says, admonish one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. It's not just in the book of Psalms, it's all over the Bible, including in the New Testament. Music is not listed in the New Testament as a spiritual gift, but music has such a huge part of the Jewish Old Testament worship and Christian worship that those lists of gifts are not exhaustive. And I've always believed that music is a spiritual gift. It can be a talent in the world, but it's also a gift that can be a spiritual gift that God can use. Israel's music and history is totally linked to David. Completely linked to David. Not only was he a great musician, but he wrote, his name is on 72 of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. Some of those may have been written in honor of him or in his style, but he wrote a bunch of those Psalms. He appointed a man named Asaph to lead worship in the temple, in the tabernacle and then in the temple, a man named Asaph. What's interesting about Asaph is that he served in that position for 2 generations. I don't know how young he was when David appointed him or how old he lived, but he served through the reign of David and through the reign of Solomon, his son. They both reigned about 40 years. So this guy served in that capacity for a long, long time. He also started a school of music and worship. And we know that school lasted for generations. In fact, if you go all the way to King Hezekiah, near the end of the time of Judah, this school was still going. And Asaph's name is on 12 different psalms that we have in the book of Psalms. In other words, temple worship was started by these 2 guys, and it impacted it for generations. So that's just a little point that I wanted to bring out. Music is a huge part of what we do as Christians, and it should be, because it's a huge part of the Bible. Thank you, worship team, for what you guys do. And it's much appreciated, and I know the sound man and the music leader are some of the least thanked people in a congregation, because they only see them when it doesn't go right. But thank you, Carrie Ann and your team, for what you guys do. But that isn't the main point of this passage. It's just the sidelight that I wanted you to see. The main point is how God is sovereign and the way he uses things in our lives. And so I want to point out that God even uses evil spirits to accomplish his purpose. That seems amazing sometimes. 3 times in this passage, it says the harmful or evil spirit from God. And 1 time, it says the harmful or the evil spirit from the Lord, from Yahweh, God's proper name. Now, that sounds odd, awkward to our Western ears, our Christian ears, because we as Western Christians tend to focus on God's grace and goodness, sometimes to the extent that we ignore God's wrath and discipline. And yet, God can use a lot of things to bring about his wrath in people's lives or to bring about discipline of his people. He can use sickness. He can use defeat in various things. He can use troubles and finances, and he can use demons for that purpose. In his sovereign control, God allows demons to do their work, and he has a way of turning that around to accomplish his purposes. You know, there's a sense in which Saul deserved this because he had rejected God's word and God had rejected him. But that's not the only case we see in the Bible. There are times when righteous people are impacted by the evil spiritual world as well. The best example would be Job, that God allows faithful people to be tested, and sometimes in the spiritual realm. When Job was told to curse God because of everything going wrong, his response is, shall we accept good from God and not evil? He seems to recognize that God allows that evil to come. In Lamentations, The book of Lamentations is a short book that's right after Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote it. The prophet Jeremiah was living in Jerusalem when the city was destroyed by the Babylonians. And he sat down and he wept the destruction of his hometown and the place he lived. And he wrote it down in poetry form. He lamented it, and we call it the book of Lamentations. And in that book, he often says, this is what God has brought upon us. And so even sometimes the faithful and righteous people suffer evil because God allows it. You know, there's even places in the New Testament where we see God using evil spirits to accomplish his purpose. Probably the most famous one is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And Paul says, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to keep me from exalting myself. You see, God used a messenger of Satan in the life of Paul the Apostle so that he wouldn't puff himself up more than he should have. God has a way of using evil spirits to accomplish his purpose. Now, that being said, realize that God is in control, and he will never allow evil or evil spirits to harm his people in a way that would get them off track or ruin them in some way, because God is the one in control. And so as followers of Jesus, if that's who we really are, we look and say, we serve a God who's in control. So we accept from him not only the good things in our lives, but also the bad. If those bad things are out of our control, we have to say they're under God's control. And we accept them because God is using them to do something in my life. And you know, ultimately, God is more glorified when he takes his people through trials and troubles than when they don't have trials and troubles at all. You know, if you had no problems in your life, that wouldn't draw the non-Christian world. But what draws them is when they see you struggling with some of the things they struggle with, and you have a God that walks with you, that you trust in and carries you through that. That's what can draw them to Christ and glorify him. And so God has a way of using that evil to accomplish his purpose. And it's not just evil. It's all the details of our lives. And so the next point is God sovereignly connects us to people and places to accomplish his purpose. He oversees all the details of our lives. In fact, he arranges all the details of our lives to put us where he wants us to be. As David said in that prayer, the God who accomplishes his purpose in me. God arranges the details like that. A couple examples. Think about Moses. Moses was raised in the court of Pharaoh, and yet his mom was able to school him and teach him about the God of Abraham. And Moses knew the court of Pharaoh, and he was the perfect person to come and approach Pharaoh to set the people free. God had arranged the details of his life to do that. Think about Joseph in the Old Testament. He was sold into slavery. He was thrown into prison, and God just happened to put him in the prison where some of Pharaoh's servants were. And God arranged all those details that look like bad details to put Joseph on the throne of Egypt and accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Think about the Apostle Paul. He was raised in the strictest branch of Judaism. He was taught by one of the most famous teachers of the day. And yet, he was a Roman citizen. And that was exactly what God needed to bring the gospel out of the land of Israel into the Gentile world, was somebody like that. And God prepared all the details of that in the life of Paul, and so too in David. He's arranging all the details. In fact, last week we pointed out how David was anointed king, and the first thing he did is went back to the sheep fields. And it was there that God taught him courage, and it was there that God gave him strength, and it was there that God gave him a shepherd's heart that he later exhibits for the people. And now we see David being brought into the royal court, and he's beginning to learn the affairs of state. And he's gaining, as we will see as time goes on, the confidence of the people. And it was a way for God to train him in endurance because if you know the story, you know, and as we'll see, Saul eventually became jealous of David and tried to kill him. And David had to flee from him. And it was all of those things that God used to make David a man after God's own heart. And that's how the scriptures describe him, a man after God's own heart. What a beautiful description that is. And God is using these situations for that. I want you to notice some of the details in this passage that maybe you might have missed. I want you to see the contrast between David and Saul. It's interesting that Saul says, his servants say, send for David who's in the sheep fields. It's almost as though Saul is kind of putting David down in his place. You know, I'm the king, you're just a lowly shepherd. Saul is the master. David is his servant. Saul is the afflicted one, and David is his comforter. The Lord departed from Saul. The Lord was with David. And the spirit of evil was on Saul, but the spirit of the Lord was on David, and it says it remained on him. A fascinating contrast, the difference between those two, and yet somehow God brought those two together in order to accomplish the purpose that he wanted to accomplish. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing to see. Another interesting detail is that this servant of Saul just happened to know a musician. Now, what are the chances of that? Here's a guy who serves in the temple or in the home of the king. There wasn't a temple at the time, or a palace, I mean, but he served in the king's home. And somehow he knew of a shepherd a few towns away who was a musician. How did that happen? That's a pretty amazing thought. What made this servant think of that musician when there was probably a whole bunch of them between Saul and David that they could have picked out? Why did he think of that one, and how was he acquainted with him? That's just one of those details that only God could arrange. And God did that. And so David served Saul. And he served him for many years, even though he was already anointed as a future king. He was already anointed as the future king, and yet he served Saul, and he continued to do so. And if you know the story, you know he never once raised his hand against Saul. Never once did he do that. He just continued to serve him in spite of injustice, in spite of what was unfair, in spite of the fact that Saul was out to kill him for a while. Never once did he raise his hand. He continued to be a faithful servant. He somehow knew that God would accomplish his purpose. He somehow trusted that God would accomplish his plan. And that's the kind of God we know. That's the kind of God that can be trusted. Do you feel like you're getting beat up? Maybe you feel like evil's just attacking you right now for some reason. Or do you feel like the details of your life, the circumstances you're in, are just taking you someplace and you have no idea where it's going? Those are the kind of situations that I think these principles address. You know, David knew he'd been anointed king, but he didn't know where his life was going. He didn't know it was going to be years. He didn't know Saul was going to try to put him to death. And yet, as all these details came together, God was using those to bring him to the right place. And we can look to God and say, God will work all the details of my life out to be what he wants him to be. He will accomplish his purpose in my life. That's a God that we can trust. We're going to close not with a prayer, but just with reading those words I started with and we prayed through, Psalm 57, as the worship team comes up, because it's so appropriate to this situation. Again, David wrote these when Saul was out to kill him and he was hiding in a cave. And he said, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me. For in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. We serve an incredibly sovereign God who takes all the details of our lives, as we sang, and even the evil that seems to be attacking our lives and turns those to accomplish his purpose. We can trust in that God. He will bring victory.